Ebola has now spread from the Democratic Republic of Congo to neighboring Uganda. A 5-year-old boy has died after crossing the border into Uganda earlier this week. Now, 2 new cases have been confirmed. They include the child's younger brother and grandmother.
These are the first cases of Ebola since the latest outbreak erupted in Congo last summer. About 1,400 people have died there so far. So for more on this, we want to bring in CBS News correspondent Deborah Pata. She's joining us now from Johannesburg. So, Deborah, we've been covering the Ebola crisis here at CBS News since it began in August. You also covered the epidemic in 2014. What do these new cases in Uganda mean for this outbreak?
Well, Anne-Marie, this is the nightmare scenario that everybody was hoping to avoid, that the Democratic Republic of Congo outbreak, now in its 11th month, would spread to neighboring countries. This has happened. Sadly, as we know, as you said, that little 5-year-old boy died. 2 other members of his family are confirmed as having contracted the disease. It would seem that the child's mother, who is Congolese, married to a Ugandan, traveled to the DRC earlier this year to care for her dying father. He died from Ebola. 12 members of her family were put in isolation after this, but 6 of them escaped, including this little boy. They crossed into Uganda, which the border is about 50 miles from Beni, which is the Ebola hot zone, and now the disease has reached that country. The Ugandan government has long been prepared for the possibility of a cross-border spillover. They vaccinated up to 4,700 health workers in about 165 facilities, including the facility where this little child died. So they are well prepared for this, and they have a good chance of containing this epidemic if they can track and trace everybody that this little boy came into contact with, because they don't have the same kinds of complications that the DRC has, namely that outbreak is taking place in a war zone.
Right. That was my question to you, Deborah. Clearly, as you point out, Uganda has been prepared for something like this. It's got a very stable infrastructure. It's one of Africa's leading economies. On the other hand, over in the DRC, things are much more complicated, coupled with the fact that it's a much larger country, much poorer.
And this is the Democratic Republic of Congo's 10th Ebola outbreak. They've very successfully dealt with 9 other outbreaks. But as we've mentioned repeatedly, it is taking place in a war zone, and that is what is hampering efforts, because you have over 30 militia groups operating in this area, one of them with affiliations to ISIS. And they indiscriminately attack the community, and every time there is an attack, members of that community flee, and if they've contracted Ebola, the virus flees with them. So that is one of the first problems. The other problem is that the militia groups and sometimes members of the community are attacking Ebola treatment centers and health workers. A number of health workers have already died. So they're risking life and limb, both in terms of the deadly disease and also attacks from the community. Coupled with all of this, you have deep mistrust from the community. They are saying, you know, we've been dying in this country for nearly 25 years. That's how long the civil war and the conflict has been raging in the areas of Beni and Butembo. And now suddenly we see UN planes flying in, we see 4x4 vehicles. Why are you only coming now to help us when we've been dying of violence and other diseases like malaria for so long? The cynical view is that they're only there because they want to stop the spread of this disease to other countries. But the net result of this is that people are not going for treatment. You have 10 to 20 new cases every day in the DRC, and only 40% of people are actually going for treatment. Rather, 40% of people are not going for treatment, which means they are dying in their homes and not getting the help that they so desperately needed. And if you bear in mind that the bodies of those who've contracted Ebola are at their most contagious after death, this is a very serious problem indeed. One woman very poignantly said, at night, the militia come and take our children. By day, the men in white, referring to doctors or health workers in hazmat protective suits, come and they also take our children away. So this is the complication and is the reason for the spike in deaths. The toxic mix of violence and the mistrust of the community means that in the past 3 months, the number of cases has doubled from 1,000 to 2,000. And as you mentioned, nearly 1,400 people have died of the disease. And it shows no signs of abating. It's getting worse every day there.
So, Deborah, you recently spoke to the U.S. ambassador to Congo about the Ebola crisis. I want to play a little bit of that sound.
It's critical. I mean, this is the first defense of the homeland of the United States, is what we're doing here to prevent it, again, from spreading elsewhere. And we also have teams deployed in neighboring countries who are advising South Sudan, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi. Our USAID teams and as well CDC are there to increase preparedness.
So how is the U.S. or perhaps other groups helping to contain this outbreak?
Well, let's start with the international community and then get to the U.S. We interviewed Michel Yah, who is the head of the Ebola response from the World Health Organization in the DRC. Very dedicated. This man hasn't seen his family for months. And, you know, he talks about the bravery of his colleagues who, as I said, risk their lives every day, both in terms of dealing with this deadly disease and in terms of the violence that they have to face every time they go to a treatment center or travel to a treatment center. They're doing everything they can, but this spread of the disease across the border is obviously going to put pressure on them to be even more aggressive in their response to this outbreak. One of the things they're going to have to look at is possibly more creative solutions. They have the vaccine. That's life-changing. They have amazing new treatment methods where they treat Ebola victims, which stops the prevention of the spread of the disease more effectively, really. But this is all useless if you can't reach people and people are not coming for treatment. One of the interesting things is that in Liberia, what they did was that they traded food for safe passage with the armed gangs operating in the slum areas, which were very congested. And there were a lot of people having contracted Ebola there, dying of the disease. So they gave these groups food in exchange for safe passage. They're going to have to look at some kind of creative solution. It's difficult. You make peace or have a cessation of violence with one group, then you have 29 other groups that you've got to deal with, but they're going to have to start to think very laterally. In terms of the United States, they've been involved in the Congo for some time now. One of the key things they've been doing is training epidemiologists so that the DRC itself is able to deal with the disease as they have very effectively done in the past. The other thing that they're doing is that they set up USAID, a DART team, which is an emergency response team, which helps provide resources and people to the DRC in terms of their response. They are the biggest contribution to MONUSCO, which is the peacekeeping force trying to provide security in the region, and they've also provided financial aid. And as you heard Ambassador Mike Hammer say there, they've been talking and working with other countries to help them with their preparedness should this disease, as it's now spread to other regions, happen. And one of the things that they're committed to assisting with is the tracking and tracing of people. That is key. Speed is key. Track and trace the people that Ebola sufferers have come into contact with, and you have a good chance of ending this disease. So certainly the international community is trying very hard, but all of this is a reminder that Ebola is not just a DRC problem. It's not just an African problem. It is a problem that affects all of us, and we should all be concerned about this outbreak.
And Deborah, earlier you mentioned that they're also sort of regularly combating other diseases. Are they dealing with a measles outbreak as well?
There is a problem with measles. There always is a problem with measles in the DRC. I mean, we ourselves had to take medication to prevent the contraction of things like malaria, as that's another issue that they're dealing with there. But yes, measles is a big problem. So, you know, they're saying, why Ebola? Why bother about Ebola? There's so many other things that could happen to us in this country. So that health system, as you mentioned, is under extreme pressure in the region.
All right, Deborah Pata reporting this very important story for us. Deborah, we were showing video of you earlier back when you've traveled to the DRC. So you've been on this story for quite some time. We appreciate you sharing the details with us.